This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your hosts, Radio Joe Hughes and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day and welcome to IAQ Radio Plus episode 692. This week we welcome John Lapotaire of IAQ Solutions in Orlando, Florida. We're going to talk. It's always great to get a little field report from John and go over, what's going on out in the field, but he's also very involved with industry associations and developing industry standards. So we'll be talking about that as well. But before we get started, let's thank our sponsors. They're the reason we can continue doing the show. Don't forget, after the show, afterthoughts.iaqradio.com, sponsored by First On Site. IAQ Radio marquee sponsor is First On Site at firstonsite.com. IAQ Radio Association sponsors are ACGIH, the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists at acgih.org. AIHA, the American Industrial Hygiene Association at aiha.org. IICRC, the Institute for Inspection, Cleaning, and Restoration Certification at iicrc.org. The Restoration Industry Association, RIA, at restorationindustry.org. The Environmental Information Association, EIA, at eia-usa.org. IAQ Radio industry sponsors are AEML Laboratories at aemlinc.com, Particles Plus at particlesplus.com, TSI Inc. at tsi.com, Tramex Meters at tramexmeters.com, and Healthy Indoors Magazine at healthyindoors.com.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio Trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick at cs.com. Or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man.
All right, no Z-Man today. He's out at the IICRC meetings in Vegas, so I'm going to handle the trivia question, and I don't know if I'll get it right or not, but I'll do my best, Cliff. Who was the first chair of the IICRC S520 committee when it was an ANSI-approved standard? All right, let's move on. We've got John Lapotaire today. He's a building envelope and indoor environmental consultant, providing IAQ consultation for commercial and residential properties. He's got a bunch of certifications. He's a past IAQA president, and he served on several industry association committees and boards, both international and national. John, welcome back. Always great to see you in the war room.
Hey, always good to be here.
All right, buddy.
Thanks for having me.
I was looking back through the old shows. I think I've had you on here like 10 times, John. Usually it's with a group of people or with your lovely wife, Lydia, but we always appreciate getting your perspective from the field. But also, you work a lot with industry associations. And, right now, I know you've been working hard on a couple of standards, at least one. Let's first get the background on S520. Talked about that in the trivia question. Where are we with the S520 right now? There's a new revision going on, I guess. How's that coming along?
Yeah, they just put it out for public review. The public review is closed, and the S520 consensus body is now reviewing the comments and deciding how they're going to act upon those comments. And depending on the amount of comments and the level to which they apply the comments to the standard, they may have to go back for a second public review. But we won't know for a little while yet on exactly what's going to come of the comment period.
Okay, and what were your thoughts on the change? Were there major changes? Was it kind of an update, spring cleaning kind of thing where we go through and change a few things?
I would have to say it's well beyond spring cleaning and a few updates. I think they expanded in certain areas. I think they expanded in the condition 2 area. I don't think it's going to change much. In my opinion, the removal of mold is simple. containment to control the dust up from the removal of mold, all pretty basic. The harder part of mold remediation is finding the cause and origin of the moisture that supported the mold growth. The removal, we get caught up in the weeds of complicating the removal, and I've just never thought it was that complicated.
Well, when you say they're expanding the condition two, that's kind of that's the area where there's always some gray, where people were worried that maybe mold spores got from the source into other parts of the building, maybe into the mechanical system, et cetera. How are they just expanding on how they look at it? Or are they giving more detail on how to differentiate between something that's contaminated and not contaminated?
A little bit of both, but I think their primary focus was on making sure that you understand that a condition 2 can't exist without an identified condition 3, and that condition 2 specifically originated from condition 3. So if you take a surface sample, for example, in my living room, and you find mold, that doesn't mean that's a condition 2. That's a condition 1 of my living room. But if there were a condition 3 in the living room and you took a surface sample, then there's some likelihood that it came from the condition 3. But the hardest part about condition 2 for anybody to get a hold of is that it's all opinion. It's literally 100% my opinion, because it can't be supported in any way. You can't take a surface sample to the genus and a surface sample on the wall to the genus and connect the dots, because there's too many species in each genus of mold. You haven't narrowed it down. You haven't conclusively determined that the mold on the floor is the mold from the wall.
What if you did a PCR test on it?
It would still be very difficult. You still couldn't conclusively determine the extent of condition 2. And right now, nobody's doing PCR testing for condition 2. Typically, what they do is they see mold on the wall, and then they take air samples in every other part of the house, and they might take a surface sample. In most cases, it's Aspen. So they've got Aspen on the wall, and they've got Aspen in every room in the house, and therefore the Aspen in every room in the house originated from the wall, and everything's cross-contaminated, and everything, including the air conditioning, needs to be cleaned. But that's not very scientific.
Well, that kind of leads us into the new standard that I understand IICRC is working on. And I haven't followed it as closely as I guess I could have, but there's an S530. Can you tell people a little bit about what that standard is designed to do?
Yeah, I'm actually the vice chair of that committee, and that's basically the mold assessment standard. We've worked quite a bit on it. It's going to replace, I guess, the ASTM D7338, which is the assessment of mold. That would be the prevailing standard now. The IICRC decided to write their own standard. I think the benefit to the IICRC writing the standard is that they have a better delivery system than ASTM. So ASTM has the standard. It's been out for quite a while. It doesn't get broadly taught, and it's not very well introduced to the restoration field or the IEP field. So when the IICRC finishes the standard, they're going to start training it so people will become more aware of what a mold assessment is, which is not the collection of air samples. So our focus on our committee is cause and origin and extent of the damage. So we're going to, just like the ASTM, require that you determine the cause and origin, and with the use of a floor plan, determine the extent of the damage. There's nowhere in the S520 that it says to remove 2 feet beyond anything. That was perpetrated by the guidance document, and now everybody just removes a wall and keeps going for 2 feet. Well, an IEP needs to determine what needs to be removed. We've been doing that for years. So it's not that it can't be done, but there was originally some pushback on the committee from some people that said that there may be mold assessors that lack the ability to determine the cause and origin of the moisture supporting mold. I'm like, well, damn, that's kind of like being a barber, but not wanting to learn how to cut hair. That's your primary focus. Showing up on the job site for a mold inspection and declaring that there's mold is not the reason you were hired. They called you because they have mold. They called you because they want you to tell them why they have mold and how to keep it from coming back. And that's what the S530 will be focusing on.
It's very interesting that IICRC is writing this standard. I don't think they've too often, if at all, gotten into the consulting side of things. Essentially, I look at it as you have consultants, you have contractors. Some people call them IEPs, some people call them different things. But and a lot of that in the past was done by people from industrial hygiene world, industrial hygienists, certified industrial hygienists, AIHA folks, did a lot of the consulting when it was necessary. And the IICRC always was, I felt like they represented more of the restoration side of things, and that those contractors, and for a long time, there was an argument about whether or not there should even be IEPs mentioned in a mold remediation standard. And that was kind of made up back years ago. They made up the term indoor environmental professional. They made up a definition of what an IEP is. I guess I'm wondering why IICRC, you kind of told me that, no one's really following the ASTM, and IICRC is also out there training a lot of the remediation guys, but do they have the expertise to train people on the consulting side, the IEPs? Because let's face it, I'm sure that's the next step. We're going to have a class that will be a certification class, and people will be certified to be IEPs. Are they the right group to be doing that?
I think possibly they will be. If the standard is written well enough, then I don't see why they shouldn't. In recent years, the IICRC has really blown up in creating a positive work environment for the IEP, whether it's fire or mold or crime scenes. They are really establishing a good work environment for the IEP. They're really, when I started in this business in the 90s, there was no such thing as an IEP. We wrote our own scopes of work. We provided our own containment. We did our own mold remediation. But let's face it, today, if you go into a typical mold remediation, that scope of work will be so exaggerated by the mold remediator that they are really exaggerating the loss, to the extent that insurance carriers are leaving the state of Florida. The state of Florida and other states have decided to create a licensing law that separates the assessment of the mold from the mold remediator. Granted, that didn't work at all, but that was the intent. The intent was to stop the mold remediators from exaggerating the loss. So here comes the development of, like you referred to, the IEP right to work law, the mold licensing.
Or the IEP Full Employment Act, whatever way you want to look at it.
There you go. And so now you have all of these IEPs that show up and provide a mold assessment. And the mold assessment usually says nothing more than, Eureka, the lab says there's mold, remove it 2 feet beyond, consult a licensed mold remediator. Not an assessment. So any training that you could provide from just about anyone that follows the standard that we're writing, that says find the cause and origin and define the extent of the damage using a floor plan, if you teach those two things and keep the sampling pump in your truck, then yeah, I think the IICRC can teach that.
Now, but doesn't this really, it seems to me like it's something that needs to be addressed in the state laws where there are state laws, because if they're able to go ahead in, it seems like they're requiring a third party to some degree. You don't have to have one on every project in Florida, but they're not requiring that third party do a cause and origin. Is that accurate? I'm not that familiar with Florida law. I know in DC you're required to do a cause and origin.
Yeah, in Florida there are no standards whatsoever. You can do whatever you want, defined by whoever wants to define it. There are many different industry organizations that have their own methods. You know, there are people that are fogging using ozone. It's the Wild West down here, so there's no requirement at all. What we lobbied the state in the beginning is to adopt the prevailing industry standard of practice, which would have been the S520 and the ASTM 7338. They opted not to do that. They said, let them decide on their own. So without a minimum standard of practice, there is no standard of practice. So these guys can show up, charge whatever they want for the collection of a few samples, call it a mold assessment, and move on down the road. It's why after a hurricane, these guys show up as licensed IEPs, and they go into properties that haven't been stabilized and don't have power, and they're collecting thousands of air samples, calling it a mold assessment on a property that's open to the elements, and sending an invoice to the insurance companies.
Well, that's a Florida issue, and I think it happens a lot in places like Texas as well, when there's, you know, disasters and people come in and they take advantage of the situation. Another topic. Okay, so you're going to focus on, and I've got a little outline here. Of course, you always do the scope, the purpose, and the application, the definitions, the principles of assessment. So identifying the origin and the cause, establishing the extent of the mold, documenting all that, writing a protocol. Is that going to be a requirement that they write a protocol for the remediation?
Yes.
Okay. And what is that protocol going to be? Follow the S520, essentially.
Pretty much, yes. We're trying to tie it in as closely as we can to the same language as the S520. So we're going to try and marry them together so they work hand in foot.
All right. So now we've gotten to the point where we're doing the remediation and somebody's going to verify that remediation has been completed. I think one of the most controversial things you're going to attempt to do here, if I'm not mistaken, is develop some type of post-remediation verification criteria. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, we're keeping it simple. Not going to put anything in there that's going to require you to sample heavy. Keep it clean. Make sure that the building materials were removed that you identified as needing to be removed. Make sure that the condition 3 areas are gone. Make sure that the moisture source has been corrected, and make sure it's clean and dust free using a white or a black cloth. That's it.
Okay. Okay. And have you run into a lot of pushback on that?
No.
Okay.
Nobody in the committee feels any differently about what's required for post-remediation verification. I think it's unfortunate for the restoration contractors that for years they get beat up because of a spore count. There's an industry out there that has zero tolerance molds. I don't know where any of this craziness comes from, but if it's removed, then the intent is for the contained work environment to have no negative impact on the uncontained areas when the containment is removed and the areas reach equilibrium. That's what it's saying in our post-remediation verification section. It's that simple. No negative impact when the containment is removed.
I guess who is on the, I'm not looking for names, but I'm looking for who they represent. You know, do you have people that represent building owners and building managers and maybe government and remediation contractors and maybe the AIHA or, you know, the industrial hygiene people or something like that? Do you have a good cross section of people from around the industry?
So the ANSI requires us to have 3 different groups: producers, users, and those that have general interest. So a producer would be an IEP, a user would be a remediation contractor, and general interest would be property owners and that type of individual. So we do have people with postgraduate degrees. We have CIHs. We have restoration contractors, IEPs like myself. So we're required to have a good balance of all 3. So it's going to be a good balance.
And how long do you expect this to take, John?
Standards. I've been on standard writing committees that have taken the better part of 10 years, and I've been on some that have taken just a few years. I would expect 3 years. We're making some pretty good headway now. So I'd say in a couple of years, this will be out.
Okay. And what about determining if HVAC systems have been impacted? How are you handling that?
Well, the current ASTM standard says that you got to open it up and look, and you've got to inspect the ducts. So we're going to do the same thing and reference the NADCA guidelines. So we're wanting to work directly with NADCA on that. But yeah, I think you should open the air handler and inspect it.
And is that a subpart of the standard? I mean, I know that like in the fire standard, that's kind of a separate little standard, at least for NADCA wrote a kind of a separate little standard for that. Is that going to be included, or is that going to be a separate standard itself?
It's going to be included. We're not going to make it that complicated. We'll reference the NADCA document, but opening the access panels to an air handler or the access panel to a plenum or a duct, or removing a supply register to inspect the duct, there's nothing to that. And there is nobody that I'm aware of in the state of Florida that doesn't want the mold assessor to inspect the mechanical equipment for mold. The HVAC contractors do not want to do it. Their organization has completely stated that they want to defer to the licensed mold assessors. So open the mechanical equipment up and take a look at it. It's really not overly complicated.
And I've heard different opinions on whether someone who is not a mechanical contractor, not licensed, can do what you're describing. Are they allowed to go into ductwork? Are they allowed to pull the panel off of a air handling unit? Are they allowed to do that type of inspection without understanding mechanical systems necessarily?
So in the state of Florida, in every county that I've ever inspected in, the answer is yes, you can. It falls within the scope of your work as a mold inspector. It states in the current prevailing industry standard, the ASTM, to look inside the mechanical equipment. So it's supported by our minimum standard of practice to look inside the air handler and the ductwork. So we've had no problem whatsoever, because the mechanical contractors, they sure as hell don't want to be responsible for it.
All right. Another topic that becomes kind of, and I got a text question on it now, but I've also had a couple emails from one of our audience members that's very sensitive to mold, and also to a lot of environmental conditions. He's got severe asthma. You and I talked about CO2 being elevated, and that you find that some of your customers with COPD had additional issues when the CO2, I think, was elevated, which is a little interesting. Whether it's the CO2 itself or the fact that the CO2 indicates there's not enough ventilation, I'm not sure which it is. He's even said that temperature and relative humidity will aggravate his asthma. Are you getting input from people who are part of the, I see the text here is chronic inflammatory response syndrome type people, the very mold sensitive type people? What kind of input are you getting from that group?
So I want to be very clear, because people get upset all the time when we talk about mold and the minimum standard of practice in my house, where if I've got a small mold problem, I clean it up and it can be visually cleared. And to be very clear, I'm not saying that that's a health issue. And when it comes to people with SEERs, that's when you elevate it. You have to know your client. The client interview has to take part and be a big criteria for setting clearance. So when I say the minimum standard of practice is contain and clean and make it as clean as the rest of the house, that's perfectly fine. But if you have somebody sensitive, then you have to go above and beyond. You're going to do a little bit more. We definitely have input from those people, and we definitely understand that we're going to need to raise the clearance criteria based on the client. So I want everybody to understand minimum standard of practice is not something that we're going to hold people to if they're sensitive. We're going to go above and beyond for those people, definitely.
Will there be a section on that?
No.
Okay, so this is just the minimum practice.
Sure.
Will you even mention in there that it may not be appropriate, let's say, for those with
It's
those
going to
who
be
are sensitive?
Yeah, it's going to be addressed that during the client interview, you have to set the certain criteria that you have to understand your client. So it'll be addressed, but it's not going to be a separate section, and we're not going to go into just like the S520 doesn't go into how to remediate for somebody that's worried about nanoparticles versus minimum standard for mold removal. The same thing for the post-remediation verification. This is the minimum standard you need to get a remediator off the rock in a typical mold remediation environment. But if you have somebody that needs more, then absolutely.
All right. Let me get into another part of one of these text questions, and that was what about particle counts, John? I know you're a huge proponent of particle counting to get an idea of what where particles are within the indoor environment, where they're worse than where they're elevated, let's say, what they're like compared to the outdoors, what they're like compared from room to room. Are you including anything on particle counting, or are hoping to include anything on particle counting within the standard?
We're actually on that right now. We're hung up a little bit on how to put that in there. I think particle counting is one of the most important things for an IEP. If you're taking an air sample for mold spores, you're really missing a lot. I saw a flash that somebody was making a comment that people are suffering in schools because of minimum standards. I don't think it's that simple. When you measure airborne particulates, you need to measure every room of the house or every room in the school and find out if the area is producing something or if it's accumulating something. You'd be surprised how many times a house or a school or an office building is simply accumulating. Housekeeping isn't as good as we think it is. Housekeeping handles the surfaces that we see, but we can disturb the areas that we don't see simply by rolling around in a chair or coming in and out of a classroom. So for me, particle counts are very, very critical. Particle counts with the air conditioning off, and then again with the air conditioning on, so we can see how well the indoor environment is performing. But more importantly than particles is the carbon dioxide. We find that more schools and office buildings, and especially homes now, are suffering from high carbon dioxide, and it's not particles that is a problem for people that have asthma or COPD.
Interesting. John, I've got one more I think we can get to before the break, and then we'll keep going through these. But one of our audience asked, how do you find qualified IEPs in your state to consult and assess? What a great question. Other than referring them to you and IAQ Solutions, where do you go to look? Where do you find these people? I mean, not everybody listens to IAQ Radio. Obviously, I got like 25 people on here live. We'll get 400 downloads. But, where do you go to find these IEPs?
There are three places that we would recommend you go: AIHA, IAQA, and ACAC. And go to their Find a Pro, enter the zip code, and find somebody. But it's all in the interview. We tell our clients and any consumer, be very specific on what you're asking for. And if you want your indoor environment assessed, then ask for your entire indoor environment to be assessed. Don't ask for it to be sampled to death, because typically those that sample the most have the least ability to interpret the samples. Those that don't need the samples will do the best at assessing. So if you can measure the indoor environment, VOCs, formaldehyde, carbon dioxide, airborne particles, temperature and humidity, and you do that with the AC on and off, you're going to learn a whole hell of a lot about that house. You're going to learn whether or not you've got air infiltration from a crawl space or an attic, because the particulates are going to go up when the AC is running. So you'll know quite a bit. You'll know that the carbon dioxide is high, and that the house is sealed very, very tightly, for example, because the formaldehyde, VOCs, and carbon dioxide, they just get equalized when you run the AC. Everything just gets mixed up nicely, but the carbon dioxide keeps going up. So now you've got a beautifully weatherized, otherwise healthy home, no elevations in particulate, but your carbon dioxide's above 2,000.
You
So
know,
you gotta ask the right questions.
you're going right up my alley here. I mean, for years I would not teach just mold inspection. I felt that was wrong, and because I feel like if you're going into someone's indoor environment and just looking for mold, you're going to find mold. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Wayne Baker once said that on the show. I'll never forget it. And I always felt people should learn how to do indoor environmental quality investigations, not just mold inspections. But I guess I've been proven wrong over the years, because the states feel like that's the most important thing. And, people are doing a lot of mold related stuff, and a lot of the mold people do also check other issues. As IICRC, I remember back when I was on their board for 3 years, some of the toughest years of my life, to be honest with you. And at that time, they were considering an indoor environmental quality assessment standard as opposed to just a mold standard. Has that been discussed at all? I mean, ASTM's got a good indoor air quality standard, but nobody uses it.
Yeah, nobody's really talking about it. And the only reason that we're really hitting upon the mold aspect is because, one, it's covered by insurance, and two, people think it's killing them. And in my experience, it's less of a mold issue and more of an environmental issue. People hate to hear it, but it could be housekeeping. It could be the building itself, but it could be a myriad of other things. People seal themselves in houses today, and it's just not healthy. So a guy taught me in early 2000s, some old gray-haired guy up in Pensacola, taught me to look at every part of the house. And I appreciate that. That was you, by the way, Joe. And I haven't stopped. We've been measuring houses and finding out that people believe that they have a mold issue. They believe the schools are all mold issues. But in most cases, it's going to be a combination of housekeeping and ventilation. And I don't want to even get started on the minimum ventilation rate, because I think that's a crock in itself. The ventilation rate needs to be based on the occupants and the occupant activity.
Okay, I got to go to halftime. We'll be back for the second half. We've got John Lapotaire and enjoying it from IAQ Solutions in Orlando, Florida.
Outstanding.
Our marquee sponsor is First On Site, your trusted full-service disaster recovery and property restoration company at firstonsite.com. Association sponsors are ACGIH, advancing careers of professionals in environmental health, industrial hygiene, and safety, interested in defining their science. ACGIH.org. AIHA, healthy workplaces, a healthier world. AIHA.org. The IICRC, a nonprofit standards development and certifying body for the cleaning and restoration industry. IICRC.org. Industry sponsors are AEML Laboratories. Free shipping, great pricing, same-day results with no rush fee, AEMLinc.com. Particles Plus, feature-rich particle counters and air quality instrumentation. Count on us, particlesplus.com. TSI Inc., an industry leader in precision instrumentation for monitoring indoor air. Learn how to expand your IAQ investigations, TSI.com. Tramex Meters, developing modern dynamic moisture meters and humidity monitoring systems since 1974. TramexMeters.com. And Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online magazine for industry professionals and consumers. HealthyIndoors.com. All right, we're back with John Lapotaire. John, before the break, you mentioned that, when I talked about why is it mold, and you mentioned two things, and one was insurance coverage, because mold can, to some degree, be covered by insurance. I'm wondering, can you give our audience an update on how the insurance industry, at least in your area and other areas, I mean, I know you talk to people all over the country, how is coverage going with respect to mold remediation? Is that changing again? For a while, you know, it was covered, and then it was not covered, and then it was capped at certain levels. And what are you seeing now?
Well, it's capped in the state of Florida, and in some cases, it's not covered at all. It's probably it's one of the most abused aspects of homeowners insurance in our state. Roofing and Category 3 water is running a close second, but mold clearly was heavily abused to the point that the state came up with licensing, separation between assessment and remediation, then caps, then carriers started leaving the state. So it's obviously heavily abused in the state of Florida.
And one of the reasons we ask is that a lot of times what happens in Florida or California kind of migrates around the country. So it's interesting to see that the Florida legislature and governor recently passed a law that changed some of the insurance and how insurance handles, you know, water damage claims and mold remediation type claims. I wonder if you could tell our listeners a little bit about that situation. What happened? Why did they have to pass this new law that kind of limits things as far as I don't know if the AOB, or remember assignment of benefits, if that was gotten rid of or not. But if you could tell our audience a little bit about it, I'd appreciate it.
Well, if you're not abusing the system, it's not going to affect you in any way. The AOB was abused hugely in the state of Florida. And I know there are a lot of people out there, a lot of restorers that say they depend on the AOB to make sure that they get paid. I'm okay with that. The way that it was abused here is people were signing an AOB. The homeowner had no idea what was being charged, the amount that was being charged, or the work that was being done. So they changed that now. Now the homeowner has to be in the loop, so they have to know what's going on, and it's more of a full disclosure situation with the insurance companies now. It really hasn't changed much because people are finding, you know, end runs around AOB. I've never used an AOB. We have some pretty high ticket assessments for large losses after storms, but nothing like the restoration contractors have to carry. So I understand the need for it, but I haven't had a need for it. And if you find yourself in a situation where an industry has to make a change, then that change is going to happen because something was being abused to the point that they had to waste time and energy to stop the abuse. So it's unfortunate, but we found ourselves in that situation. But there should have always been full disclosure with the property owner from the beginning.
And so, am I right? They're not allowing that assignment of benefits anymore?
No, they can still use it. It's had a lot of changes to it, but you can still use the assignment of benefits.
Okay. I just wasn't sure exactly what changes they had made down there. Now, the other thing I question is, if you're going to have a new assessment standard, you know, from the IICRC that works with the S520, who's going to pay for all this? You're adding in an assessment now, where a lot of times in the past there might not have been an assessment. Somebody's got to pay for that, whether it comes out of the 10 grand or 5 grand that maybe they get from insurance, maybe, or it comes out of the owner's pocket. Somebody's got to pay for that.
Right. So in the state of Florida and a few other states, that's already mandated by the state. The state has already dictated that it's going to come out of either the property owner or the insurance. So in the rest of the states, they're going to have to cover it somehow. The property owner. Now,
Okay.
I'll tell you this. When we work for the property owner, and we always work for the property owner, we will tell them that we're working for them to determine why the mold is there, how to prevent the mold from coming back, and exactly what needs to be removed because it's been affected by the mold. And that really controls the loss. And that's why the insurance companies pay us. And that's why the remediation companies don't like using us because they don't want to be dictated. I've actually had one tell me that he doesn't want me to assess anything he's working on because he doesn't want me to tell him what to do. Well, that's the entire intent of the state licensing law, is for somebody to tell him what to do because he can't be trusted. I didn't create that environment. They created the environment. The industry created that environment. So now we're writing standards where we didn't have to have one before. We're trying to keep it very specific: cause and origin, extent of the damage, use a floor plan, don't be ambiguous. So it's not rocket surgery. It's really not that complicated. Removing mold and assessing mold is not the most difficult thing that I'll do any day of my life. But it can be, because the marketing department for the mold world would rather overcomplicate the process because they want to sell it for more than what it's worth. We use soap and water in minimal containment. We remove it and throw it away.
Well, I think it's interesting what's going on in the industry. I wasn't even aware. That's why I brought you on. I wasn't even aware that IICRC was working on this standard. They're also working, I know that Cliff's right now out in Las Vegas at meetings with the IICRC because they've got a wildfire standard in addition to a fire standard, which, you know, we've had standards, guidance for years on how to restore a home after a fire. And now they're trying to separate out wildfire from fire, which kind of, I'm not sure that makes sense to me, but you know, it is what it is. We like to keep people up on what's going on in the industry. Another thing we like to keep people up on is we did a few shows on the hurricane response after you guys got hit with a couple hurricanes down there this year. What are things like right now? How is that coming along? I haven't heard a lot of complaints or seen a lot of articles about, you know, bad things going on. I'm sure they're happening, but can you give us your man on the ground kind of idea of what's going on with hurricane recovery?
Yeah, I would say the majority of all of the large losses were put together by the first of the year. So, you know, we're pretty good at assessing and repairing storm damage. The biggest concern from the carriers is after each hurricane, the amount of Category 3 contaminated building material removal goes up. And a lot of that is not going to be covered. Stormwater from a hurricane is not Category 3. It can be, but it's not by default. It's up to the restorer or an IEP to establish that it's contaminated, grossly contaminated, and that it can't be restored and needs to be removed. But if you gut places, then you're going to have a property owner that's going to have an insurance adjuster show up and not cover a lot of that loss. So we are seeing a lot of that. After every hurricane, we see more of it. So Category 3 removal and not restoration is probably the biggest problem
With respect to hurricane recovery. And Howard, I mean, I know that Pete and his group had a conference down in that area that really got hit down towards Fort Myers, Naples. How's recovery coming along?
It's going very well. I was at that conference. My son, he spent a couple of months in a RV in South Florida, working for a couple of restoration contractors. He's back now, but they're doing pretty well. It was devastating for some areas in Southwest Florida, very devastating, life-changing for sure. It also changed the beaches on the east side of the state. So it was a devastating storm, but the recovery is coming along very well. We were under power in a very, very short period of time. It was amazing how well they prepared and recovered and had us back in power and water, and even in the worst hit areas.
I don't know if people all realize that also that storm went up through your area, Orlando, and caused a lot of water damage. Are you guys seeing a lot of mold cases as a result of that?
Not really, no. The water rose like we've never seen it before. I mean, I had 4 feet of water in my backyard. I'm about 3/4 of a mile away from the St. Johns River, and it just about got to the house, blew out our well and our septic system. And there were properties that were underwater for an extended period of time, but not a lot of mold cases. In Central Florida, we are pretty much so well beyond any of the hurricane damage, even those that were underwater. They were underwater for a couple of months.
You know, I'm looking through these texts again, and I see one that I want you to comment on, and that is, there's been a big push, and I get this all the time. I get people that are trying to work with sensitized people that go to MDs and they get these urine mycotoxin tests, and they have high mycotoxins in their urine, and they get people in to treat and test, and they're trying to figure out how to denature mycotoxins and all this stuff that personally I'm a little suspect about. But, you know, I'm wondering, are you going to address that topic, mycotoxins and removal of mycotoxins in this, or identification of mycotoxins in this mold inspection standard?
No, absolutely not. We personally deal with a lot of people that have had their urine analyzed, and they have probably collected, in many cases, their own ERMI, and you know, they end up with a few nanograms of something in their house, and they want to pay thousands and thousands of dollars to have it removed. Well, 100% of the time, in the cases that I'm dealing with sensitized people who think they have a mold contaminated house, what they have is an accumulation of a few nanograms. And no matter how much money they spend on cleaning their house, tomorrow, when the remediator leaves and they open the front door, those few nanograms will return. So you have to be careful with the craziness. Most of the people that have mycotoxins in their system, with the physicians that we work with, it's there because of food ingestion, not because of environmental exposure. We live in a very clean and healthy environment. We're not surrounded by moldy homes. All of my clients, with very few exceptions, in the last 23, 24 years, all of them have had the means necessary to identify and correct the problem. It's very, very few. My renters have the ability to move or make a correction, but those that can't, those are the ones that are going to be highly sensitized. But the people that are going to the MD, these are middle-class America. They own their home. They clean and maintain their own home, but yet they're being convinced that because they've found a few nanograms of a mycotoxin in their house, that their house is contaminated. I personally think it's ridiculous. Get a true mold assessment. Find out if you're producing mold in your house or if it's being accumulated. If it's being accumulated, come up with ways to keep your house cleaner, but also address the fact that it might quite possibly be the food that you're eating and not the minute amount of mold or mycotoxin you found in your house.
John, I got to go. Let's go to the roundup, John. All right, we're going to wrap this up here, John, but I really thought, you know, we talked the other day to kind of touch base before we did this show, and one of the things that we talked about was you do a lot of spray foam inspection and spray foam expert witness work. And I wanted to, you mentioned to me something you've been seeing a lot of, and I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about spray foam, and then I'll get back to these questions that are coming in on the chat.
Okay. So we do a lot of assessing of spray foam, and a lot of our referrals for spray foam come directly from the Spray Polyurethane Foam Alliance, their industry association. They have a consultants committee. I'm a part of that committee. People that have problems with spray foam can hire one of two different people. The guy that's going to show up and collect a lot of samples, chemical samples, Sometimes they do it for straight VOCs. Sometimes they're doing it for isocyanates. It could be anything, but the real question is, are you going to spend all of that money trying to determine whether or not there's a chemical signature of misapplied foam, or if you're going to hire somebody to look at the foam and see if it was installed correctly? A lot of my clients have already spent a lot of money on the VOCs and the chemicals just to find out that there's no smoking gun. It won't tell you anything. But when we get there, we'll cut out a large section of foam, in some cases 24 areas, and look at the cross-section of the foam. And the Spray Polyurethane Foam Alliance has the guidelines for inspecting foam. And it will tell you, look at the cell structure, the knit line adhesion between the sheathing and the foam, the thickness of the foam, the amount of the passes. So we actually physically inspect the foam. We render an opinion on whether or not the foam was installed correctly. And then we look at the rest of the house. What is the condition of the attic that you're now sealed in with? Does it still have the remaining insulation that should have been removed? Is it filled with 50 years of accumulated debris and rodent poo? Is the conditioned space of the attic, is it being conditioned? Because the code has changed now in most states to require circulating air through the attic. That was the number one reason that there was occupant complaint or mold growing on foam, is because nobody circulated air through the attic. So now the code has caught up. If you're familiar with the code for crawl spaces, if you encapsulate a crawl space, you have to own it. You have to circulate air through it. You have to control the humidity. In the crawl space, you have to have a sump pump. Well, the code was lobbied to have the same requirements for an encapsulated attic. Seal it, control the humidity, and circulate air through it. So now there's a 50 CFM per 1,000 square feet requirement of moving air through it. All states have the ability to adopt it. Florida adopted all of the code improvements with the exception of circulating air in the attic. Doesn't matter. In order to fix it, you have to circulate air in the attic. Some attics are a good candidate for spray foam, some are not. When it comes to the occupant who's complaining that they're sick from the foam, most of the time it's because they've been sensitized to the foam. It's very, very unfortunate. There are spray foam contractors that will spray the foam in the house with the homeowners in it. Those people, they should just be incarcerated, because you can make somebody sick for the rest of their life. They're not going to live back in the house. So if you've been exposed to the foam when it was being applied, you can't unring that bell. And it doesn't make everybody sensitized. I might walk in there with you and you become sensitized and I'm fine. We don't know what makes people sensitized. It's not an age issue. It's not a gender issue. It's an individual issue. But you can also be sensitized if they don't ventilate properly. So each manufacturer has a ventilation rate to establish reoccupancy. So they spray the foam, they sample the air, they know that they've got a presence of these chemicals, and it needs to be exhaust ventilated until they're gone. And there's a rate for that. Different manufacturers will have an exaggerated and increased ventilation rate for a quicker reoccupancy time. But the key is all of them have a ventilation rate for reoccupancy. So when we interview the clients on the phone and they tell me that they never saw a fan and there never was a fan on the job until 2 weeks later when they said the odor will go away. Well, the VOCs from the application of foam, when not exhaust ventilated, fill and permeate the entire house, and they get absorbed by the drywall and the furniture. And that odor lingers. It's very difficult to get rid of it, but a bake out works very well. Hydroxyls help. But exhaust ventilation is critical, because if somebody comes into their house and it wasn't exhaust ventilated, then they could become sensitized. If they sleep in their house the next day, if they wait 24 hours and go in there, but it was still filled with VOCs, you can still become sensitized. So the spray foam industry, when you're assessing the foam, you need to find out how it was ventilated. You need to find out the condition of the attic. You need to find out if they improved the HVAC to circulate air in the attic. Then you need to find out if they're bringing in outdoor air to meet the minimum ventilation rate because they sealed themselves in. And then you have to determine the installed condition of the spray foam. So that's a lot. And that's a lot more than most people want to do when they're inspecting occupant complaint for odors associated with spray foam. They just want to know if there's an elevation of chemicals.
I've got another good chat question here. What's the current pulse on spray foam particulates, dust in attic, and HVAC containing fire retardants? Our audience sees this being a remediation effort versus general vacuuming. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, let me rephrase it for them. There are particulates that come from these products, okay, and they end up in the environment, on the floor of the attic, or whatever the case may be. I would imagine most companies just vac them up with a shop vac.
Right.
Do you recommend something else?
No. One of the problems that you have with attic installed air handlers is that they don't do a lockout, tag out, and protect the air handler. So we see a lot of times that the air handler is running and it sucks this crap up. So now you're looking at a much larger problem. Correctly installed spray foam doesn't have a whole lot of dust. It's going to cure very well. It's going to react without a lot of that little dust everywhere. So it's usually slightly off ratio. If you put your hand anywhere in the attic and you pick it up and it's full of sticky stuff, that's not good foam. That's not correctly installed. But we don't have a lot of problems with the dust unless somebody's not doing their job correctly.
And one more, how long do you see isocyanates lasting in the air that EMSL suggested rarely detected after a few days?
Probably you have seen easily hundreds of sampling after spray foam was installed, and not once have we ever captured it.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah,
John,
it goes away fast.
always great to talk to you. I had one other thing I wanted to ask you about. With respect to tight homes, you've mentioned that a few times. Looks like you're running into more problems with respect to tight homes because code now requires homes to be tighter and tighter. And also, I would imagine not only does that increase CO2 and other things, but humidity as well. Are you still specifying whole house dehumidifiers? And I guess what other types of issues do you see with tightness?
So the biggest problem that we have with occupant complaint in a home today, and this doesn't matter the age of the home, everybody's weatherizing the hell out of their house. Everybody's using the highest SEER air handlers they can get. So now you have a house that's producing what we refer to as just daily use VOCs, perfume, deodorant, cooking, cleaning, everything's going to produce some level of VOC. Well, it's not going anywhere anymore. In a spray foam house, everything stays within the envelope. Everything is there. And you're just recirculating it. So the air handler high SEER runs less to save you energy dollars. So it's removing less humidity. So now we've got humidity problems. So people have humidity blooms, xerophilic mold growth from high humidity. But people are not feeling well. If they don't have a humidity bloom, they just call us because they're just not feeling well when they're at home. So, well, you're in a 2,000 square foot house and a family of 4, maybe 6, and a dog, and your carbon dioxide's above 2,000. You know, you got to crack a window.
Yeah.
But in Florida, you can't crack a window. So we specify to bring in outdoor air through a dehumidifier. The dehumidifiers that we spec have a MERV 13 filter, so we're cleaning the outdoor air, then we're drying the outdoor air, then we're introducing it to the return, and it's going through another filter, and now it's mixing with the indoor air and going to all of the different rooms in the house. So we'll typically tell our clients that we're going to improve their filtration to a 4-inch filter. If it's a filter back return, we just shove it further in the wall. If it's under the air handler, we just lift the air handler, put a new filter rack in. So now you've got a MERV 12 under the air handler, a MERV 13 coming in from the outside. We're circulating the air more, putting the house under a positive pressure, drying it, and we're reducing the VOCs, carbon dioxide and formaldehyde in the house and the airborne particulate. So it works all the way around, providing that you've completed your thorough inspection of the inside and the outside of the house, and we're not producing any bad things. No rodents, no roaches, no water intrusion, no leaks, no shower and plumbing leaks. If the house is in good shape, if not, we give them a list of everything that they need to do to keep the bad things from happening. So now you're dealing with accumulation versus production, and accumulation can be corrected with filtration and ventilation air.
Excellent, John. John, thanks so much. Always appreciate joining you and getting the latest from the field, and getting you also work with a lot with the associations. We appreciate that. Any final thoughts before we go?
No, use a particle counter. Measure carbon dioxide. Try never to do a mold inspection alone. Check the whole house.
Filtrate and keep it clean, huh? I know you brought that up several times, and I really like that emphasis on, housekeeping's a big thing, and people have to realize that they have a big responsibility in taking care of their own indoor air quality as well. So thank you, John Lapotaire. I appreciate you joining us, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon. Also want to thank John. You got to have faith that the controls, our fantastic sponsors, our loyal audience members. I'm trying to get a show next week on East Palestine, because East Palestine, Ohio has had some major issues after that train derailment. It's led to indoor air quality issues for people, of course, water-related issues. I'm working on that. We've also had another industry pioneer, unfortunately, pass just recently here, Hal Levin. So we're either going to replay Hal's shows next week and spruce them up there from a few years ago, or we're going to get this East Palestine thing done in the next couple of weeks. But we'll be back next Friday with the next episode of IAQ Radio Plus.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.